Father, now as we open our Bibles, would it be symbolic of our open hearts? And would then the information from our open Bibles fill our open hearts? In the name of Jesus, amen. I didn't grow up on fairy tales. When my family became serious about their Christian journey, my mom pulled the plug on the TV, put it out on the sidewalk. One morning we got up and there was a hole in our living room. The TV was out on the sidewalk. And you know, back in those days, those TVs, that was not some small feat for a 5'7" mother. But the TV was out on the sidewalk. We had no idea that life could be fulfilling without the cartoons. So I didn't grow up with fairy tales. But in every tale, there's a bit of a truth. Hans Andersen is the one who gave us this tale. It's The Princess and the Pea. You know about The Princess and the Pea? It's been a while since you've read that story. Once upon a time, there was a prince who wanted to marry a princess. Don't we all? Most of us have. All of us have. What am I saying? I mean, those who have, never mind. But wanted to marry a princess, but she would have to be a real princess. He traveled all over the world to find one, but nowhere could he get what he wanted. There were princesses, but it was difficult to find out whether they were the real ones. There was always something about them that was not as it should be, so he came home again, was sad, for he liked very much to marry a princess, a real one. One evening, a terrible storm came through, and there was thunder and lightning. The rain poured down in torrents. Suddenly there was a knock heard at the city gate, and the old Mother Queen went to answer it. There was a young woman claiming to be a princess standing before her. But good gracious, what a sight the rain and the wind had made her look. The water ran down her hair and her clothes. It ran into her shoes and out through her heels. Yet she claimed to be a real princess. She just needed somewhere to stay the night. Well, said the Mother Queen, we'll find out if you're real or not. But how? She said nothing more. The Mother Queen went into the bedroom where the damsel in distress would be staying. Took all the bedding off the bedstead and laid a pea at the bottom. Then she took 20 mattresses and stacked them up, and then 20 down beds on top of the 20 mattresses. On this, the princess had to lie all night, and in the morning she was asked, how did she sleep? Oh, very badly, she said. I have scarcely closed my eyes all night. I don't know what was in the bed I was lying in, but something was hard, so very hard. I have a bruise on my back. It's horrible. From then they knew that they had found a real princess, for only a real princess would have such awareness that there was a pea at the bottom of the mattresses. In every tale, there's a bit of truth. In every tale, there is a bit of truth. Could it be that the small things, the very small things, the insignificant things, are what reveal who we truly are? Could it be the small things reveal more than even the large things? Let's go, Daniel chapter 2. We're going to, you say we're taking 2 months for Daniel, but we're leaping through the book of Daniel because we're going to have to go at least 2 chapters at a time. Last week was the introduction. We are Daniel chapter 1 and 2. So we're going to jump right into Daniel chapter 2. We're not done with Daniel chapter 1. We're going to visit it to finish off this morning. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. Now that Aramaic expression, had dreams, is either he had multiple dreams in the same night, that just, the reoccurring, it kept happening. He would wake up distressed, he'd go back to sleep, wake up again, multiple times. It's a plural expression of either the same dream, the same night, or the same dream multiple nights, or the same dream that just never ended in that one night. It just kept going and it just consumed. That's the Aramaic expression. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. Now, this is just an aside. I find it of some interest. Just let that sink in. A pagan king was given a dream by the God of heaven. Pagan. Pagan. I find it somewhat interesting that within the community of faith that knows Daniel 2 better than any other community of faith, we point our bony fingers at either the president or the president-elect declaring how God could not use one of the two. But he delivered a dream to a pagan king. Believe you me, God doesn't need our way to win an election in order to have his way win. Doesn't need it. Sorry to meddle in your politics. Pagan king had a dream. This same king has put God's people into captivity. From a human standpoint, he's the enemy of God's people. Let's talk about this dream. An image, Daniel will later describe to him, is in his dream. Now, let me put it on the screen so you're picturing what I'm picturing. Here's this image. Gold head, silver, bronze, iron. Come on, we've heard this a dozen times. We know Babylon, and then the combined forces of the Medes and the Persians, which is interesting that the Medes had early on worked with the Babylonians together. And then as things go, they broke off, and now they're with the Persians. It's not as clean as sometimes we have concluded in Daniel chapter 2, as if boom, 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 boom. It was messy, the transitions. And when one overcame another, it didn't happen in one night. We know of the story of the Medes and the Persians taking over Babylon, but that happened in one night. But the conquest of the Babylonian Empire did not happen in one night. It was a very messy transition, and little by little, they did their work. All right. Then Alexander the Great showed up. Lightning speed, conquered the then known world. The Grecian Empire, and then Rome with its cruel iron teeth showed up on the world. We know this, Daniel chapter 2. And then comes this moment, however, where we have just sometimes written it off. Of course, iron mixed with clay, 10 toes. Where do we get the 10 toes from? You didn't get it from Daniel. He's less concerned about the 10 toes than we have been. We have decided, based on later studies in the book of Daniel, which I believe are accurate, but in this moment, Daniel is not concerned about 10 toes or whether there was a division. He's concerned about the iron and the clay and how it just won't go together. All of Daniel's life, there has been a world-ruling empire, Babylon, then the Medes and the Persians, and then he sees Greece and Rome, and then he says, and then there's a time in Earth's history where there's not a world-ruling empire, that people can't be pressed together or put under the same system. It could even be in the same, if you follow the conclusion that there are 10 toes, and those 10 toes represent 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, which is fine. Then within those 10 toes is also the iron and the clay, meaning within the divisions, there's also division. And so Daniel is wrestling with this iron and clay. People don't go together. That's what Daniel's concerned about in Daniel chapter 2. Later on, he gets to the 10 divisions. That's not his concern here. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. Go there in your Bibles, put it on the screen as well. In the time of those kings, the world doesn't go together. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom. Now just listen to the language. It's not an overnight event. He will set it up. He will build it. We've read this, beloved, as a community of faith, we have read this over and over, that moment is the rock, the second coming. It happens in an hour, in a moment. God sets it up. But that's not the description that Daniel gets. He says, in the time of those kings, God of heaven will set something up. He will build his kingdom, which will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. Keep reading. It will crush. That's an Aramaic term. It's the same term that Daniel uses later for the fourth beast, which we will get to in a few weeks. Don't worry about it today. But here's this fourth beast who destroys, who crushes. It's not an overnight event. That fourth beast does it slowly, surely, destroying one part at a time. This is the same expression used only in the book of Daniel for God's kingdom. It will crush slowly, surely, building its way. In the time of those kings, it will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. Now, verse 45, Daniel's speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain. Now, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel's now sharing it with him. He sees those four metals, and that time that people just don't stick together. They're divided. They're tribal even. We learned that word, right? And then there's a rock cut out without hands, meaning this has nothing to do with human success. The leader is not human. Whoo, this is powerful. The leader of this kingdom is not human. And it comes and grows and fills the whole earth. It grows. There's this process illustrated. We have relegated it to a moment in time when Jesus comes. That's not what Daniel 2 says. Daniel 2 says that God's kingdom builds and is established and crushes, similar to the fourth beast that continues to grow in power and authority. God's kingdom does the same. That rock grows out of the mountain, not by human hands. And then he says the dream is true. In a world of turmoil, its interpretation is trustworthy. I ask you the question then. I'll put the picture back up on the screen for you. Where are we in that statue? Where are we in that timeline as Daniel painted the picture to King Nebuchadnezzar? Here, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, this divided world that does not come together, cannot be forced together by love, by politics, by anything. Where are we in the timeline? Some will say to me, we're in the toes. Others will say, no, we're even further. We are, man, there's some toenails hanging off this thing. We are in the toenail. And you're wrong. You're wrong. I believe you're wrong. The final generation plays a different role than every other generation before. Even if you were to understand that those 10 toes represent 10 divisions of Europe, those 10 divisions no longer exist as 10 divisions. So we're not on the toes anymore. What is Daniel trying to communicate? He says, in the time of those kings, God will introduce another kingdom that will grow and begin to crush little by little. It will be established, and finally it will fill the whole earth. Where are we in the prophecy? We're in the rock. What does that mean, beloved? That means there ought to be a sense of urgency that no other time period has ever seen. They were all on the statue, but now this final generation plays a role in building the kingdom, in establishing the rock. Verse 44, let me put it on the screen again. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. We see these transitions of power between Babylon and Medo-Persia as an overnight event, and none of them were. Sometimes the critics use that against the true and accurate interpretation of Daniel 2, because we present it as if it was overnight. There were key events, but these transitions often took years. God sets up his kingdom. It will never be destroyed. Once it's established, it won't ever end. It will endure forever. John Woolvord, in his work, The Key to Prophetic Revelation, says this verse, verse 44, is the crux of the interpretation of the entire vision. This is it. This is what it was meant to be. It was cut out without hands. It doesn't do things with human invention. It doesn't do things our way. It's not like the rest. The rest by force. This one does it differently. This kingdom is established without force. Beloved, we have taken this kingdom and said, no, it's only in heaven. It comes here as the second coming, and then it takes the saved home. But that's not what Daniel 2 says. It says in the time of those kings on this planet, there will be a kingdom established. It may not be recognized in the United Nations, but there's a kingdom that has been established that will never end. Hallelujah. We're on the rock. So what does Daniel 2 have to do? What does Daniel 1 have to do with Daniel 2? Thanks for asking. I shared Mark Finley's line on the screen last week. The prophecies tell us when, and the stories tell us how. They're both prophetic. The visions will tell us when, what's the timeline, what are the players, and then the stories, the narratives are prophetic in telling us how. How do we play a role? And so Daniel 1 is to Daniel 2 just that. Daniel 1 tells us how we play a role in that rock. Now, I put Mark Finley's words on the screen, not because he's the only one, or because it's not my own conclusion. I've done my homework, I've done my research, and I've come to that conclusion. I only quote Finley. I put him on the screen because Mark Finley's name on the screen looks a lot better than this slide does. But this is my conclusion. The visions give us the timeline, and the stories, the visions give us the timeline, and the stories tell us how God will fulfill that timeline using us. We're the fulfillment of the prophecies, beloved. Without a final generation, without a righteous remnant, these prophecies don't work. The purpose of prophecy, the purpose of the work of God through all of this, his numero uno concern has always been you and I. He can take on Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, but he needs a final generation. He needs a group of men and women, young and old, who are willing to stand for him in every detail. Now, you know the book of Daniel is not laid out chronologically. It's not chronological at all. You got chapters 7 and 8 that actually happened before chapters 5 and 6 chronologically. So there is very strategic writing on the part of Daniel to lay things out in a certain way in his book so that it communicates a message. And that's where our study will go through the next 6 weeks. But Daniel chapter 1. Daniel specifically, intentionally puts right before Daniel chapter 2 because Daniel chapter 1 is the answer of how Daniel chapter 2 is going to happen. You've got to know that Nebuchadnezzar is thinking, okay, how is he going to build a kingdom that will never end? I want to know, which is why he then produces this golden image, because Nebuchadnezzar wants to do what only God can do. So Nebuchadnezzar is asking that question, if only in his mind. Daniel chapter 1 gives the answer of how God will build a kingdom that will never end. It's that fascinating. Daniel chapter 1. You there? Great. Daniel chapter 1. There are three takeaways. And then we're going to tie a bow on it. 3 takeaways. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Oh, bad news for Jerusalem. They had heard what the Babylonians had been doing all across the landscape. They knew this was the end. Their Jerusalem would not hold up. And then in verse 2, Daniel, the audacity he has. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And he uses Lord, the Lord, he uses the term Adonai, which means the master and ruler over everything. That's how Daniel sets up the narrative. Here's Adonai gives his people to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar thinks he actually did it himself, but God is in the background saying, do your thing, Nebuchadnezzar. I've got a plan through this. I'm Adonai. And Daniel alerts his readers, the very second verse, it's the God of heaven who's in control of everything. It's his, he did it. He did it. It's okay if he did it. The context, here's lesson number 1 from Daniel. The context of Daniel chapter 1 and the entire book is that of controversy, of conflict, with God in control behind the scenes. Believe me, you know, Daniel couldn't have made sense of this. He's 17, maybe 18 years of age. He believes that his God is more powerful than any other God. He believes his God is the only God, which gave them some accused them then of being atheistic because they only had one God. So here's an 18-year-old young man saying, my God is the only true God. But this pagan king comes and takes us captive? The whole thing is confusing. It's a world of turmoil for Daniel. It's a world of turmoil for us. The final generation parallels very closely. It's a prophetic word for the final generation, the book of Daniel. His world is full of turmoil, but behind the scenes, he believes that there is Adonai, the ruler and master of everything. The conflict, the controversy, he doesn't understand. Why are there groups that are so violent and attacking other groups? Why? Why is culture like it is? Why? Daniel doesn't have the answers. He just takes the position that in this conflict, in this controversy, God is still Adonai. The politics that we are sometimes tempted to engage in sound much more like, I have to have it my way or it's not God's way. If Daniel had taken that position, he would have been wrong because God was in fact the one who had given them to captivity. And that was not Daniel's way. And so if he said, no, unless my guy gets elected, then God certainly did not have his way. What a short-sighted, narrow vision it is of any of us to say, unless the guy I vote for gets into office, then it's not God's vote. There's way too many chiefs in the church than there are Indians. God, I don't understand what you're doing, but I'm going to go with you. I'm going to stick with you. It doesn't have to be my way. Why is my way always God's way? Number 1, lesson from Daniel chapter 1 for the final generation is that our context will be the great controversy, conflict. There will be turmoil. There will be things we don't understand, but behind it all is Adonai. Lesson number 2. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself. This is Daniel. He resolved not to defile himself. He purposed, some of your translations will read, he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Whether it was dietary or whether it was spiritual because of the food being offered to idols, it could be all of the above. But some of us are tempted to look at this and just point out, it seems kind of a small thing. It seems like there's a lot of other things that Daniel could have taken a stand for, and then it seems like he could have just kind of made it through. Interestingly enough, the very first temptation, the very first fall had to do with diet, had to do with a very small thing, and eating a piece of food. Maybe it's in the small things, after all, that we reveal who we are. The pea at the bottom of the mattresses tells more about our royalty than we've given credit. Oh, it's a little thing. It's a little thing. I told the young people, the only time that you quantify something by size is when you're in the wrong. You never, if I'm on the receiving end of your lie, I don't say, That's a little thing. If I'm on the receiving end of your anger, I don't say it's a little thing. You say it's a little thing because you're in the wrong. We never quantify something unless we're in the wrong. Come on, everybody's doing it. It's not that big of a deal. If you say that to yourself, it's probably wrong. Lesson number 2 from Daniel is he was faithful even in the little things. Absolutely faithful. Does it make a difference? Do little things make a difference? Absolutely. Little things make a difference. In some regard, little things tell more about us than the big things. The big things, nobody's going to go around murdering and raping. We've got some extreme, demented people on the planet, sure. But it's the little things that make the difference. A lot like airplanes. Have you noticed that with exception of our favorite airline, Spirit, most airlines are white. You got Spirit that breaks the mold and paints theirs yellow, but most airlines are painted white. There are several reasons. One is heat, but another is weight. Dark paints have more pigment, which makes the plane heavier. It is said that if an entire plane was painted a dark color, it would add the weight of 7 or 8 passengers. You know what that means? They've got 8 passengers who aren't paying because it's just paint on the outside of the plane. So the airlines have gone white. In 2018, United Airlines switched their in-flight magazine to a lighter paper. All they did is saved an ounce per magazine, just an ounce. Over the plane, it was 11 pounds. The entire plane, they saved 11 pounds. You take that over the course of a year and their entire fleet, and they saved 170,000 gallons of fuel, or $300,000, just by taking an ounce off of every magazine. Back in the 1980s, the CEO of American Airlines decided, this was back when you got food, right? You got a little meal on your 3-hour plus flight. And the CEO, Robert Crandall, decided to take an olive off of every salad served. American Airlines saved $40,000 in olives in 1 year. Do little things matter? Sure. Probably the funniest, well, maybe funny, except if you've ever had to do it. Japanese airline El Nippon Airways in 2009. It was a short-lived request, but they requested their passengers use the loo before boarding, estimating that they reduced their carbon emissions by 5 tons each month with a plane full of empty bladders. Little things add up. Here, Daniel lays out an example to the final generation, the ones who will build the rock, the ones who are part of that expanding kingdom. He says they are faithful in every detail they can be. There's not one thing that they pass over as, oh, that's the little. I don't bother with that. They are faithful in the details. They have resolved, they have purposed in their hearts. They will not defile themselves, even with a portion of the king's delicacies. Lesson number 1, Daniel 1 tells us that final generation will be steeped in conflict, but behind the scenes is Adonai working out his way. Lesson number 2, that this final generation that's part of it, that expanding rock, will be concerned, resolved, determined in their hearts that they will not give in one area. Oh, beloved, if we could just grasp this. This is serious, this is life and death, and we have people, even ourselves, that play with this. It's not a big thing. No. We know what we're doing. It's just a little thing. Little step. Yeah, I mean, it's not really immoral. Maybe it doesn't give it's not a big thing. It's just a little thing. I'll compromise in this one area because it saves me money. I'll compromise. I'll give up what I believe is absolute faithfulness. Joseph, Daniel, saying, no, we will have nothing to do with this. And we begin to play the game of it's not a big thing, or I'll just do it this once to save some money or to save a friend. You're playing with your eternity and the eternity of others. The final generation will be faithful, purposing in their hearts that even, I remember calling a friend of mine, hey, listen, we were talking about something and I said, listen, if I fudge the date that I moved to Colorado by just a couple of days, I save myself the penalty of not having registered my car within a certain amount of time. And he said to me, Michael, pay the penalty and do what is right. Fudge the date? It's just a week later. Nobody cares. Doesn't hurt anybody. Pay the fee and do what is right. Lesson number 3. I had to look this word up. It's in the glossary of military terms. I just had to make sure. Is it actually a military term or is it infiltrate? No, I looked it up in the glossary. It's an actual word where small groups of personnel, assuming soldiers, are put in behind enemy lines in an enemy context, in a hostile territory. Infiltrate. Daniel chapter 1 tells us that God's plan is to infiltrate the enemy territory. What does this have to do with you? Let me tell you. First, let me convince you of this is exactly what God did. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 5. What does Daniel chapter 1 and verse 5 say? This is Daniel and those captives, they were trained for 3 years by Nebuchadnezzar and his educators. And after, they were to enter the king's service. Now, this is powerful. I've never seen this before. Nebuchadnezzar had a plan to train these young people for 3 years so that afterwards, it's brilliant, he would retread them as his representatives to go back to their people and represent his values to their people. That's his service. God says, I'll allow it. We would be scratching our heads saying, God, you can't. Those are our young people that are going to be trained in the Babylonian ways. It's going to destroy them. God says, I'm still Adonai. He allows them to go into this training. Now, look at verse 17. Because of their faithfulness, because of their absolute resolve to be obedient and to be faithful to God, God could use them. Verse 17. To these 4 young men, the ones who had determined to be faithful in the little things, God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. Who was their actual educator? God. Nebuchadnezzar had this whole thing where he was going to educate these young people. God says, fine, I'll allow that. It's going to put them in enemy territory. But because of their determined faithfulness to him, I will be their educator behind the scenes. I will be the one whispering in their ears, this is actually the truth. Nope. I will train them. I will educate them. God was their teacher. And now listen, look at verse 19. What happened? They served the king. Nebuchadnezzar all the while is going, I got some bright minds working for me. And God is behind the scenes saying, you just let the enemy into your camp. You open the door for my people. You see, what Jesus later said in the New Testament, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. The church is not to have its gates so the hell cannot prevail, but hell itself ought to be afraid of the church. Nebuchadnezzar opened the doors to Babylon and said, hey, I'm going to train you. God said, they're faithful to me. I'll be their teacher. And while they served the king, they served the king from Adonai. Babylon, or Nebuchadnezzar thought he had a good plan, but he opened the gate and his camp was infiltrated. That's the final generation. That's how the final generation works. The culture of today will try to brainwash you. It'll try to consume you. Hey, watch more media. Oh, please don't. Get on this. Follow this. Believe in this. Put your backing behind this earthly individual. It will try to brainwash you, as Nebuchadnezzar did, even changing their names. He tried everything. But because of their absolute resolve to be faithful to God and to be determined, purposed in their heart, this was not a casual decision. This was not a one-off. This was an absolute unbending decision. We will not defile ourselves. Because of that decision, God was able to be their educator. And then he said, hey, I need you in Babylon. You're the spies that I'm going to use. What does this have to do with us? What does this have to do with us? That stone, the Aramaic term crush, dikak, the Aramaic term, it means that it will grow sometimes imperceptibly. That means God is building this kingdom, this rock. It's growing. In the days of those kings, God will set up his kingdom, and that rock is expanding. And the world is going to look on and say, how is it working? We'll kill you. We'll punish you. And yet you continue to expand. You can't build a group together on a love for God. That doesn't work. You've got to have might. You've got to have power, politics. And somewhere behind the scenes, Adonai saying, no, I'll just use faithful boys and girls, faithful men and women. And they will infiltrate the enemy camp. What Nebuchadnezzar thought he was doing, God used for his advantage. Here's what we often, in a community of faith like ours, talk about. Hey, how do we protect ourselves? How do we get out of the cities? I understand this is a very personal question. And there is counsel both to go to cities and to leave cities. I understand. It's something that your family has to wrestle with. My concern in the role that God has called me to is that I often hear the call to leave cities, to go away, to protect our family and to shun those evil influences. And it begins to sound a little bit like the Pharisees when they looked at Jesus and said, Jesus, don't you know the company you're keeping is an evil influence? Jesus is thinking, how else am I supposed to build my kingdom? If we all retreat to the wilderness, how am I supposed to build my kingdom unless we have contact with people? Let me give you a line from Testimonies, Volume 5. As the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was the signal for the flight to the Judean Christians, there was a signal. They knew when they were to retreat. So the assumption of power on the part of our nation, that would be the United States, in the decree of enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us. It will then be time to leave the large cities, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes and secluded places among the mountains. Now, if God calls you to a place outside of people, that's his business. That's between you and him. But there has often been this question, do we leave? Do we go? Do we protect ourselves? Beloved, who saves or who works for the people? Bill Crispin works, Tim Keller, he's an urban missionary in Philadelphia. His line, let me just put it on the screen. The country is where there are more plants than people. Good. The city is where there are more people than plants. And since God loves people more than plants, he must love the city more than the country. Now, don't get worked up about that. But sometimes what has been on our heart is I need to set the gates to protect me. And Jesus walks in with the prostitutes and the tax collectors and says, I need somebody to infiltrate the enemy camp. I need people that will go, that will insert themselves into places like Taco Bell. What an amazing story. And I'm telling you, it's worth going to both services around here because the Suizos shared a different story in first service than they did in second service. Blew me away. That's what God needs, is faithful, radical followers of him who shun the politics of the world, who shun the ways of the world, who turn their back on all that culture has to offer and look full into the face of Jesus and with resolve are determined to follow him. He needs them to be inserted into the enemy's camp, into the culture of the world. How else are we going to seek and save the lost? And you can say, well, I need to protect my family. Fine. then you start by being faithful in every detail. Set an example. But when you start writing off whole cities and whole communities, whose sister and whose brother do you mean it isn't worth your time or worth the risk? Are you talking about my sisters? Are you talking about your brother? It's not worth the risk to go save them? Who are you talking about? Learn the lesson of the thermometer and the thermostat. One tells, reflects the temperature in the room, and the other determines and changes the temperature in the room. What we need, what God needs in a final generation is a thermostat. Changes the temperature. The greatest, and then she says, the greatest want of the world, not the greatest want of God, which is implied, but the greatest want of the world is men and women who will not be bought or sold, who will in their inmost souls be true and honest, men and women who do not fear to call sin by its right name, men and women whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle is to the pole, men and women who will stand for the right though the heavens fall. That's the greatest want of the world. That means the world needs that, beloved. And while we're talking about it, I looked up, hey, where does everybody want to move? Denver's numero uno. San Diego, it's right behind it. Portland, it's on the top 10. Our community, one of the most attractive places in the world. God needs a final generation in the front range. Maybe we could argue more than any other place in the world. One that will understand that there's conflict and turmoil. There's a lot we don't understand, but behind the scenes is Adonai. One that understands that we have to be faithful in every detail and in the specifics, in the small things of life. That's what determines who we are. And number 3, those who will be willing to infiltrate the enemy camp for the cause of the kingdom that will never come to an end. Hallelujah. Let's go. Let me tell you, Elias Brasil de Sousa, he wrote a book entitled The Book of Daniel. He's a bright mind and part of our community of faith. He writes these: he who uttered the first word of creation will have the last word in history. He's building a kingdom that will never come to an end, but it's going to be full of those who understand that there's a lot of turmoil that we're going to live through, those who understand that they must be faithful in every detail, and those who understand that they must go insert themselves into the enemy's camp. That's how this is won. One final story, and the worship team's coming. Ted Engstrom, in his work, Motivation to Last a Lifetime, he talks about a story on a cruise ship. Oh, come on, cruise. Wouldn't we all like to just go on a cruise? He's telling a story about a cruise ship in which a young lady fell over the railing into the dark, cold ocean. Passengers immediately began to crowd around the rail as the cry went out, "Man overboard, man overboard." One of the first to the railing who had been nearby was a 70-year-old gentleman. And as the crowd began to press, he was pressed up against the railing. Later that night, after the woman was rescued, and the 70-year-old man who went in after her, both rescued. He was now sitting at the head of the table in the stateroom as the captain gave a speech and crew gave a speech. And everybody was celebrating the hero on their ship who went in after the young woman. When the moment came for him to give a speech, the anticipation was high. He was their local hero. The stateroom became hushed as he reached up to the microphone. And the 70-year-old gentleman, with a bit of embarrassment, said, "I just want to know who pushed me." And as the story was told, he didn't go in, at least voluntarily. As he had looked over the balcony and the crowd pressed in about him, he was pushed, shoved in, and it looked like he was the hero. One day, I believe we'll gather around the throne of God with a multitude of men and women who have been rescued from the pits of hell. And they'll say to us, I just want I just want Micheal to speak up. I want the Sweezels to share how they were so heroic in rescuing us. You know what we're going to say? We're going to look at God and say, was it you that pushed me? Because I would have never done that. I would have never gone in. Was it you, God, that really did it? It's a stone cut without hands. It's not us that will ever be able to take the credit for this kingdom that's built and that will never come to an end. But just because it's all of God doesn't mean that he doesn't use us. The evangelism team has put together these little cards again. These little cards that we've used for the last couple of years, just inviting people to Campion, to watch online. You've got 1,000 other ways you can reach somebody, but here's one more. It's in the kiosks. In a couple of weeks, we're going to actually give it to you with some chocolate to go give somebody like the lady at Taco Bell or your next door neighbor. 3 lessons from Daniel chapter 1 that will fulfill Daniel chapter 2. 1 is we are in a great controversy. Number 2 is that we have to make the resolute determination that we will be faithful even in the little things. And number 3, we must be willing to infiltrate. We must be willing to go. And one day, that kingdom that will never come to an end will fill the entire earth.
On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land where my possessions lie. I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. O'er all these wide extended plains shines one eternal face. There Christ the Son forever reigns and scatters night away. I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. When shall I reach that happy place and be forever blessed? When shall I see my Father's face and in his kingdom rest? I am bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land.
May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace until again we meet in worship. Amen.